A verse-by-verse study in the Book of Genesis, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter 43. What does Genesis chapter 43 mean? The previous chapter ended with Jacob's insistence that he would not allow his beloved youngest son Benjamin to be taken to Egypt with his brothers, Genesis 42 verse 38. He was willing to leave Simeon in prison there, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, 24, rather than risk seeing Benjamin come to harm. This continues a pattern of outrageous favoritism that started with Jacob's own parents, Genesis 25 verse 28, and continued into his own life, Genesis 37 verses 2 to 4. Some time has passed since the 10 oldest sons came back with grain, and the money they thought they had paid for it, Genesis 42 verses 25 to 28. The famine rages on, and the family's food stores are getting dangerously low once more. Jacob finally tells his sons to go buy more food from Egypt. Speaking on behalf of his brothers, Judah must remind their father that they cannot buy food in Egypt if they do not return with Benjamin. The Egyptian ruler insisted on it. Taking a bold stand, Judah flatly refuses to go if Benjamin does not come, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 5. Jacob lashes out, blaming his sons for even mentioning Benjamin to the Egyptian governor, Genesis 42 verse 13. It's not clear how much time has passed, but it's long enough that the situation goes from bad to worse, and the family is on the verge of starvation. Pressing the issue, Judah sways his father in two ways. First, he points out that the family, including the little ones, and Benjamin, will all die without food from Egypt. Second, Judah offers his own life as a pledge of safety for Benjamin, committing to be responsible if anything should happen to his youngest brother. Jacob can either let everyone die, including his youngest son, or he can send the entire group to see if they can obtain food, Genesis 43 verses 6 to 10. Finally, Jacob agrees. He orders his sons to take a gift for the Egyptian ruler, along with double the amount of money needed to cover the cost of both their last purchase of grain, Genesis 42 verses 26 to 28, and a new one. Finally, he prays to God Almighty for mercy for his sons, Genesis 43 verses 11 to 14. Soon, Jacob's sons find themselves bowing before the Egyptian ruler once more, this time with Benjamin at their side. The men still do not realize this powerful man is their estranged brother, Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, whom they sold into slavery 20 years earlier, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. This fulfills one of the prophetic dreams for which Joseph's older brothers hated him, Genesis 37 verses 5 to 8. Joseph orders his house steward to bring them to his home and to prepare for them a noon meal. At first afraid that Joseph means to ambush them for stealing during their last trip, the brothers are assured by his steward that God himself put the money in their packs. The steward releases their imprisoned brother Simeon to them, Genesis 43 verses 15 to 25. When Joseph arrives, the brothers present him with their gifts of goods from Canaan. Joseph takes special interest in their youngest brother, offering a blessing for him. Overwhelmed with emotion, Joseph must leave to go to his own room and cry before returning to them. The banquet guests are seated separately, according to Egyptian tradition. Joseph then seems to test his brother's jealousy by giving the youngest, Benjamin, 5 times the portion given to the others. As it happens, everyone seems happy and the meal proceeds with great joy, Genesis 43 verses 26 to 34. The understanding, at this time, is that all 11 brothers will be sent back to Canaan with full sacks of grain. Things are going better for Joseph's brothers than any of them could have hoped. Joseph has one last test in mind, however, Genesis 44 verses 1 to 2, before revealing his identity, Genesis 45 verses 1 to 3. Chapter context: in Genesis chapter 37, Jacob sends his favorite son, Joseph, to visit his brothers. Joseph does not come home. In chapter 42, Jacob sends 10 of his sons on a mission, and once again the group returns short one son. The Egyptian governor keeps Simeon as collateral and commands the family to return with Benjamin. Only when forced with starvation does Jacob risk his youngest son. Joseph, still unrecognized by his brothers as the governor of Egypt, honors the men as guests in his home, paying special attention to Benjamin. After further tests in chapter 44, Joseph will finally reveal himself in chapter 45. Verse by verse. Verse 1. Now the famine was severe in the land. In the previous chapter, Jacob resolved not to allow any of his family to return to Egypt. He knew the Egyptian ruler in charge of selling grain was holding his son Simeon. That governor's demand was that his other sons return with Benjamin, the youngest. The ruler had demanded this as evidence they were not lying about not being spies, Genesis 42 verses 10 to 12, 19 to 20. None of Jacob's family realizes this ruler is Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, the son sold by his brothers into slavery some 20 years prior, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. In essence, Jacob was willing to sacrifice Simeon rather than risk losing Benjamin, as he had lost Joseph, Genesis 37 verses 31 to 35. He held his other sons responsible for these losses. Now more time has passed. The famine remains severe, Genesis 41 verse 57. Jacob's family is getting dangerously low on food once more. This will force him into a painful and risky decision. Context summary: Genesis 43 verses 1 to 15 describes how Jacob is forced to send his beloved son, Benjamin, to accompany his other sons to Egypt to buy more grain. If Benjamin doesn't go, they will not be allowed to purchase anything. This is by the order of the Egyptian governor, who the men do not realize is their long-lost brother, Joseph. Without grain, the family will starve. Jacob agrees, sending with his sons a gift for the man, along with double the amount of money needed to buy the grain. Finally, Jacob prays to God Almighty for his boys before allowing them to depart with his precious youngest son. Verse 2. And when they had eaten the grain that they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, Go again, buy us a little food. Jacob had previously refused to allow his sons to return to Egypt for a second purchase of food, Genesis 42 verse 38. The Egyptian ruler had warned them, on threat of death, not to come back unless they brought their youngest brother with them, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. Jacob was never subtle about his favoritism, Genesis 37 verse 4, 42:28, he seemed willing to abandon the brother kept behind, Genesis 42 verse 24, rather than to risk Benjamin. Now, Jacob is forced to relent. His family is out of food, they will all die unless they buy grain from Egypt. He instructs his sons to go buy more, though he does not initially mention Benjamin. As Judah will point out in the following verses, they cannot return without Jacob's beloved youngest son in their company, Genesis 43 verses 3 to 5. Verse 3. But Judah said to him, The man solemnly warned us, saying, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. Jacob has instructed his older sons to return to Egypt to buy us a little food, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2. He has not mentioned Benjamin or the fact that he, Jacob, was the one who had previously forbidden them to return to Egypt with their youngest brother, Genesis 42 verse 38. So far as Jacob's family knows, the Egyptian ruler insisted on seeing Benjamin as a way of proving the 10 brothers were not lying about their family situation. He was testing them to ensure they were not foreign spies, Genesis 42 verse 12. What Jacob and his sons do not know, of course, is that the Egyptian ruler is their brother Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, long ago sold into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, and that he simply longs to see his younger brother Benjamin. Judah is forced to raise a difficult issue by repeating the demand of the Egyptian ruler in charge of selling grain. They can't even see the man if they don't take their youngest brother with them, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. Simeon is still being held in Egypt as collateral, awaiting their return, Genesis 42 verse 24. Jacob seemed willing to abandon Simeon rather than risk Benjamin, but now the entire family is again at risk of starving. It's notable that Judah speaks this time. It's likely there are hard feelings between Jacob and Reuben, the oldest, who often presumes to speak on behalf of his brothers. Genesis 42 verse 22, 37-38. Verse 4. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. Earlier, an intense famine forced Jacob to send his sons into Egypt to buy food. Genesis 42 verses 1-2. The governor accused them of being spies and insisted they return with their youngest brother to prove their honesty. Genesis 42 verses 19-20. He also kept one of the brothers in custody as collateral. Genesis 42 verse 24. Jacob's sons don't realize this governor is their own brother, Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, whom they sold into slavery as a teenager. Genesis 37 verses 24-28. When the brothers returned, Jacob forbade them from going back with Benjamin. Genesis 42 verse 38. Even if it meant abandoning Simeon, he would not risk his favorite and youngest son. But the famine continued, and Jacob has asked his sons to travel once again to buy food in Egypt. Genesis 43 verses 1-2. He didn't mention Benjamin, however, and Judah is reminding him of the situation. Genesis 43 verse 3. Now Judah takes a reasonable and brave stand. He insists they will go, but only if they take Benjamin. He realizes that trying to accomplish the mission without Benjamin will only get them all killed or imprisoned. Their only chance of success is to follow the Egyptian governor, secretly their well-meaning brother Joseph, and hope for the best. Not going at all means starving. Judah is confronting Jacob with the dire choice which must be made. Genesis 43 verse 5. Verse 5. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, you shall not see my face, unless your brother is with you. Jacob has instructed his sons to return to Egypt a second time to buy a little food, as a famine continues to rage. Genesis 42 verses 1-2, 43:1-2. When the brothers came back from the first journey, they reported that the Egyptian governor accused them of being spies. Genesis 42 verses 19-20. They were forced to leave Simeon behind as collateral, waiting until Benjamin was brought back as proof of their honesty. Genesis 42 verse 24. Jacob had refused this, at first. He was willing to abandon Simeon rather than to risk his youngest and favorite son. Genesis 42 verse 38. When Jacob mentioned making a return to Egypt, Judah spoke up to insist that they would go only if Benjamin came, as well. Genesis 43 verses 3-4. Now, Judah amplifies his stance. He refuses to go, on behalf of all his brothers, if they do not return to Egypt with Benjamin. First and foremost, this is common sense. It would have been pointless and dangerous for them to do otherwise. Entering Egypt without Benjamin would simply mean all of them being killed or imprisoned. The brothers don't understand why the Egyptian ruler cares so much about seeing their youngest brother. They have not yet realized the Egyptian governor is secretly their brother Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, who longs to see the only other son of his mother, Rachel. Verse 6. Israel said, why did you treat me so badly as to tell the man that you had another brother? Israel is the name God gave to Jacob, Genesis 35 verse 10. When famine struck, Jacob instructed 10 of his sons to buy food in Egypt, Genesis 42 verses 1-2. That resulted in one being held in captivity, Genesis 42 verse 24, while the rest were commanded to return only with their youngest brother, Benjamin, as proof they were not lying, Genesis 42 verses 19-20. Jacob initially refused this, electing to abandon Simeon rather than risk his favorite son, Genesis 42 verse 38. But the famine has continued, and Jacob has once again told his sons to go buy food, Genesis 43 verses 1-2. Taking a strong stand against his father, Judah has refused to go without taking Benjamin. So far as they've been told, trying to enter Egypt without the youngest brother would only end in prison or death, Genesis 43 verses 3-5. Incredibly, Jacob remains unresolved. He once again blames his older sons for his plight instead of acting decisively, Genesis 43 verse 10. His complaint is that they should never have told the Egyptian governor about Benjamin, who was not sent on the first mission. He depicts their conversation with the governor as an act of malice or mistreatment. Even in old age, Jacob continues to demonstrate a spirit of fear and self-pity, Genesis 31 verse 31, 32 verse 7, 34:30, something he takes out on his sons. Still, God will remain faithful to Jacob, as he has always done. Jacob does not yet know that the Egyptian governor is his long-lost son, Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, and all of this is a prelude to a happy reunion, Genesis 47 verses 11 to 12. Verse 7. They replied, "The man questioned us carefully about ourselves and our kindred, saying, 'Is your father still alive? Do you have another brother?' What we told him was in answer to these questions. Could we in any way know that he would say, 'Bring your brother down'?" Judah and his brothers are defending themselves to their father Jacob. Jacob is blaming them for the choice in front of him: allow his family to starve to death or send his beloved youngest son into hostile Egypt and risk losing him. The first time he sent his 10 oldest sons to buy food, Genesis 42 verses 1 to 2, they returned with one brother left as a captive and orders from the governor not to come back without their youngest brother, Benjamin, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, 24. As the famine rages on, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2, he again wants them to purchase Egyptian grain. When Judah reminds that they will be jailed or killed if they don't bring Benjamin, Genesis 43 verses 3 to 6, Jacob responds with bitterness and accusation, Genesis 43 verse 6. This is probably not the first time Jacob has made this criticism. He's upset the older brothers would even mention Benjamin to the Egyptians. Their defense, however, makes sense. The Egyptian ruler asked them directly about their family. What they claim here may or may not be literally true, however. In the earlier description of their encounter with the governor, he did not directly ask about Jacob or Benjamin. They seem to have volunteered those facts, Genesis 42 verses 10 to 11. Scripture does not often record word-for-word transcripts of conversations, however, so their statement might have been in response to a question from the Egyptian governor. The greater point is that they had no reason to lie to the Egyptians. How could they have suspected they'd be commanded to bring that brother back with them? The Egyptian ruler accused them of being spies. They rightly feared for their lives. They were desperately trying to prove their innocence as honest men. Why would they lie about facts that seemed so inconsequential? What none of the men know is that this seemingly irrational Egyptian governor was their long-lost brother, Joseph, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, 42 to 8. Verse 8. And Judah said to Israel his father, "Send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones." When Jacob's 10 oldest sons went to buy grain during a famine, Genesis 42 verses 1 to 2, they came back with a missing brother, Genesis 42 verse 24, and a command from the Egyptian governor. To prove they were not liars, they had to return with their youngest brother, Benjamin, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. Judah and his brothers know any trip to Egypt to buy grain will fail if they don't take Benjamin along. Jacob has resisted this, preferring to abandon Simeon rather than risk his favorite son. He continues to blame his older sons for putting him into this situation, Genesis 42 verse 6. Jacob doesn't want to risk losing the only remaining son of his beloved late wife Rachel. However, the only alternative is to allow the family to starve to death. So, Judah asks outright that Jacob entrust Benjamin, the boy, to his personal safekeeping in order that all of them might survive this famine. In the following verse, Judah will offer his own life as a pledge of safety for Benjamin, Genesis 43 verse 9. This is an interesting turn of events, as Judah was among the brothers who wanted to kill Joseph, Jacob's former favorite son, out of jealousy, some 20 years prior, Genesis 37 verses 18 to 20. Judah then hit on the idea of selling Joseph as a slave, instead, Genesis 37 verses 26 to 28. What neither Judah nor the other brothers know is that the Egyptian governor is that very Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8. Verse 9. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. Judah and his brothers are pushing Jacob to make a tough decision. One option is to risk losing his beloved youngest son Benjamin by sending him to Egypt with his brothers, as required by the Egyptian ruler who sells the grain, Genesis 42 verses 3 to 6. The other is to allow the family to starve to death in the continuing famine, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2, including the little ones, Genesis 43 verse 8. Now Judah promises to take personal responsibility for Benjamin's safety. More than that, he offers himself as a pledge of safety. This language indicates a serious commitment. This is not a casual promise. Judah is literally offering his own life in exchange for Benjamin if he fails to bring the boy back to Jacob alive and well. It's unclear what the exact consequence would be, but he would accept the blame forever. Reuben had made a similar offer to Jacob earlier, suggesting that Jacob could kill his own two sons if he failed to return Benjamin, Genesis 42 verse 37. Jacob rejected that, preferring to abandon Simeon, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, 24, to keep Benjamin safe. He will reluctantly and fearfully accept this suggestion from Judah, Genesis 43 verses 11 to 14. Verse 10. If we had not delayed, we would now have returned twice. This concludes Judah's appeal to Jacob to allow him to take Benjamin to Egypt to buy grain, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 9. He has pledged his own life for Benjamin's safety. He knows that if they don't do as the Egyptian ruler said, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, and bring Benjamin with them, they won't be able to buy grain. The family will starve. Now Judah expresses the urgency of the situation. Jacob's refusal to make the decision has cost them valuable time. They could have made the trip and returned twice over since the need to buy more food first became apparent. By now, food must be critically low. Jacob's fearfulness and outrageous favoritism has put the entire family at risk. Only when faced with such a dire situation will he finally give in, Genesis 43 verses 11 to 14. Verse 11. Then their father Israel said to them, If it must be so, then do this, take some of the choice fruits of the land in your bags, and carry a present down to the man, a little balm and a little honey, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Finally, after much delay, Genesis 43 verse 10, Jacob reaches a decision. He resisted sending his youngest, Benjamin, on a second trip to Egypt to buy food, even though that was the only way to buy grain and free another son, Simeon, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, 24. Until now, Jacob had resisted, even if it meant abandoning the older brother, Genesis 42 verse 38. One of the risks of returning to Egypt included the return trip discovery of money, meant to pay for grain, still in the brothers' bags, Genesis 42 verses 26 to 28. None of the family realize, yet, that the governor is their long-lost brother, Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, and he ordered their money returned, Genesis 42 verse 25. Judah's argument to Jacob was that the alternative is starvation for them all, Genesis 43 verses 3 to 9. That, along with Judah's pledge to take personal responsibility for Benjamin's safety, leads Jacob to realize he has no other reasonable choice. He will allow his older sons to take his beloved Benjamin with them as ordered by the Egyptian ruler. Now that the decision is made, Jacob lays out a plan. The brothers will take with them a gift of choice regional products from Canaan to try to win over the Egyptian governor. The gift package includes fruit, balm, honey, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Jacob's tactic of softening a potential enemy with gifts resembles his approach to the reunion with Esau in Genesis 32 verses 20 to 21. Verse 12. Take double the money with you. Carry back with you the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. After initially refusing to risk his youngest son, Genesis 42 verse 38, and much delay, Genesis 43 verse 10, Jacob is finally convinced by his sons that another trip to Egypt is necessary, Genesis 43 verses 3 to 10. Jacob is mapping out a plan, in accordance with his typically overcautious nature. After describing a gift package, Genesis 43 verse 11, for the Egyptian ruler, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, Jacob tells his sons to take double the amount of money needed for the grain. This was to cover both the cost of the new grain and the money mysteriously returned to their sacks after buying grain on the previous trip, Genesis 42 verses 26 to 28. Jacob hopes the issue with money was simply an oversight, which can be corrected to avoid further trouble with the Egyptians. He does not realize the Egyptian governor is his long-lost son, Joseph, Genesis 42 verses 8 and 25, who has good intentions in mind for his family. Verse 13. Take also your brother, and arise, go again to the man. Jacob has been giving instructions to his sons about their return to Egypt to buy more grain for the family, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2. The second trip is necessary because of the continued famine. On the first trip, Jacob's 10 oldest sons were strangely accused of being spies and forced to leave one of their number behind, until they could return with the youngest brother to prove their innocence, Genesis 42:14, 19 to 20. Worse, on the way home with grain, they discovered that they still had the money they meant to use to pay for the food, Genesis 42 verses 25 to 28. Despite the dire situation, Jacob greatly delayed in allowing his sons to include Benjamin in a return trip, Genesis 43 verse 10. Faced with starvation, he finally relents, with a plan to send gifts and restitution to the Egyptian leader, Genesis 43 verses 11 to 12. Only now, with great reluctance, he finally says out loud what he had initially refused. He tells them to take Benjamin with them, after all. Only later will Jacob learn that this Egyptian vizier is his own long-lost son, Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, whose intentions are good, Genesis 47 verses 11 to 12. Verse 14. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, and may he send back your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. 10 of Jacob's sons, including his beloved Benjamin, are assembled and ready to begin the trip back to Egypt to buy food for their family, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2. They likely also hope to see their brother Simeon released from prison, Genesis 42 verse 24, to return with them. Only by bringing Benjamin can they hope to obtain food and avoid starvation, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, 43:3-5. Jacob only agreed to this with great reluctance and after much delay, Genesis 43 verses 10 to 13. Before they go, Jacob offers a brief prayer for them. It is surprisingly rare to hear the prayers of the patriarchs in Genesis. Jacob is shown to pray in his most fearful and troubled moments, such as when he was about to be reunited with his brother Esau, Genesis 32 verses 9 to 12. It is a measure of exactly how fearful Jacob is that he prays aloud to God in this moment. He begins by addressing God Almighty, from the Hebrew El Shaddai or El Shaddai. This is a reference to God as the absolute, supreme power of the universe. Jacob prays God would grant his sons mercy before this Egyptian ruler who gave them so much trouble before. He prays that the man would send back both Benjamin and Simeon, the other brother. Jacob concludes with a kind of prayer of resignation. If the worst happens, he seems to say, then it happens. If I lose my children, I lose them. This could be read as wallowing in self-pity and a loss of hope. Or it could be read as accepting that God's will might be for his children to be lost. In either case, Jacob is clearly sending off his sons with a heavy heart and all his hope in God to control the outcome. He doesn't realize that his lost son, Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, is behind all of this. Verse 15. So the men took this present, and they took double the money with them, and Benjamin. They arose and went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. The return trip to Egypt is summarized in a single, short verse. Jacob's 9 older sons set out on their mission to get grain for the family, to get Simeon back, and to return home with Benjamin safe and well, Genesis 42 verses 11 to 14. They bring Jacob's gift for the Egyptian ruler, money to pay for both their last purchase of grain and this one, Genesis 42 verses 26 to 28, and their youngest brother Benjamin, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. The men now stand again before this mysterious Egyptian governor. Unknown to anyone in the group, this man is in fact Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, the brother they once sold into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. Joseph seems to have orchestrated these trials as a way of rebuking and testing his brothers, and to arrange to see his only younger brother. The moment of revelation is almost here. First, Joseph plans additional tests for his estranged family. Verse 16. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, "Bring the men into the house, and slaughter an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon." 10 of Joseph's 11 brothers arrive from Canaan and stand before him. They have come to buy grain, bringing their youngest brother Benjamin with them at Joseph's command, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, 24. They still don't know who this Egyptian ruler is, Genesis 42 verse 8, or why he is treating them this way. Joseph has received what he asked for. He sees his younger brother Benjamin, the only other son born to their mother Rachel, Genesis 35 verses 18 to 19, 42:38. Benjamin would have been quite young when Joseph was taken. He must be in his 20s by this point. Seeing him does something to Joseph. Instead of addressing his brothers, he tells his house steward to bring the men to his home. The steward is to slaughter an animal and prepare a noon meal for all of them. This is certainly not what any of the brothers were expecting. Context summary: Genesis 43 verses 16 to 34 finds Joseph's estranged brothers returning once more to Egypt and appearing before him. They still fail to recognize the person they sold into slavery some 20 years before. After he orders them taken to his home, the brothers are afraid they will be ambushed for a false charge of theft due to their prior visit, Genesis 42 verses 25 to 28. Joseph's steward assures them God arranged those events, and all is well. Joseph shares a meal with them, honoring them as guests in his home and giving special attention to Benjamin. The meal turns into a time of merriment for them all. Verse 17. The man did as Joseph told him and brought the men to Joseph's house. Joseph, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, once sold by his brothers as a slave, is now the second most powerful ruler in Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 44. When his estranged brothers arrived to buy grain during a famine, Genesis 42 verses 1 to 2, they failed to recognize him, Genesis 42 verse 8. As a test, and perhaps a rebuke, he sent 9 of them home, Genesis 42 verse 24, to bring back the youngest brother, Benjamin, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. Upon their return, Joseph ordered a servant to bring his 10 clueless brothers to his home, Genesis 43 verse 16. This brings great fear on the 10 brothers as they try to guess what is going on, Genesis 43 verse 18. Verse 18. And the men were afraid because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, "It is because of the money, which was replaced in our sacks the first time, that we are brought in, so that he may assault us and fall upon us to make us servants and seize our donkeys." Joseph's 10 brothers are left to guess why this Egyptian ruler would order them all to be brought to his own home. After all, the last time they interacted with him, they were accused of being spies and were thrown in jail. Why would he now welcome them as guests? They still haven't realized this man is their own estranged brother, Genesis 42 verse 8. Their fear is that this must be a plan to punish them. As they went home from the last trip, they discovered the money they'd paid for grain back in their bags, Genesis 42 verses 26 to 28, for seeming to steal back the money they used to purchase grain on their previous visit. They did not steal it, of course. Joseph had it secretly returned to their sacks, along with the grain, Genesis 42 verse 25. They have been fearful ever since discovering it that they were being set up to be accused of stealing. Now they assume the Egyptians will attack, enslave them, and steal all they have. That the brothers fear being made servants is poetic justice. They are likely still associating their crime against their brother, Joseph, with what is happening to them now, Genesis 42 verses 21 to 22. They seem worried God is finally punishing them for attacking Joseph all those years ago and selling him into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 25 to 28. Verse 19. So they went up to the steward of Joseph's house and spoke with him at the door of the house. Joseph's brothers, still not aware of who he is, Genesis 42 verse 8, fear they've been brought to his home to be attacked and forced into slavery, Genesis 43 verses 16 to 18. In part, this would be God's vengeance on them for what they did to Joseph when he was a boy, Genesis 37 verses 25 to 28, 42:21-22. It would also be punishment for not paying for the grain they purchased on their last visit, Genesis 42 verses 26 to 28. They did pay, of course, but Joseph had the money secretly returned to their bags, Genesis 42 verse 25. There's a deep irony in these men, who sold their hated brother as a slave, now fearing they will be forced into servanthood, Genesis 43 verse 18. Before anything violent can happen, the brothers rush to clear up matters with the steward of Joseph's house. They seem to hope they can convince him of their innocence before anything more happens. Verse 20. And said, "Oh, my lord, we came down the first time to buy food." 10 of Joseph's brothers are urgently trying to explain themselves to his house steward, Genesis 43 verse 19. After their first trip to Egypt, the men were forced to return home with one brother left as a captive, Genesis 42 verse 24, and an ultimatum to bring back the youngest, Benjamin, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. To their horror, on the way back, they found the money they'd used to pay for grain was back in their bags, Genesis 42 verses 26 to 28. They were innocent. Joseph, who they have not yet recognized, Genesis 42 verse 8, had the money returned in secret, Genesis 42 verse 25. Now, on a second trip, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2, the men have been ordered to Joseph's home, Genesis 43 verses 16 to 18. They are attempting to convince the house steward they did not steal back their money. They assume they've been escorted to Joseph's home to be attacked and forced into slavery for this crime. With such high stakes, the men are profusely polite, calling Joseph's servant Lord. Verse 21. And when we came to the lodging place we opened our sacks, and there was each man's money in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight. So we have brought it again with us. Joseph's brothers are urgently trying to explain to his house steward that they did not steal back their money the last time they came to buy grain from the Egyptians, Genesis 42 verses 26 to 28. They have assumed they've been escorted to Joseph's home to be attacked and forced into slavery for this crime, Genesis 43 verses 16 to 20. They don't know that it was Joseph, who they do not recognize as the Egyptian governor, Genesis 42 verse 8, who had ordered their money returned, Genesis 42 verse 25. They begin with great respect, addressing the servant as Lord. They tell him of coming to Egypt on a previous trip to buy grain. They describe the shocking moment, on their trip back home, when they found all the money they had used to buy the grain back in their packs. They assure the steward they have brought it with them to pay for the grain again, to ensure there is no misunderstanding. Verse 22. And we have brought other money down with us to buy food. We do not know who put our money in our sacks. When Joseph's brothers left Egypt after buying grain the first time, Genesis 42 verses 1-2, they were horrified to find the money they'd spent was back in their bags, Genesis 42 verses 26-28. When a second trip was necessary, Genesis 43 verses 1-2, they brought that money along, seeking to prove they had not stolen it. When ordered to go to the governor's home, the men are afraid an ambush is in the works, Genesis 43 verses 16-21. They began with great respect, addressing the servant as Lord. They told him they were shocked and they found the money used to buy the grain back in their packs. They assure the steward they have brought it with them to pay for the grain again, as well as money to buy additional food. They conclude by insisting that they do not know who put the money back in their packs. These men are unaware the Egyptian governor is their own estranged brother, Genesis 42 verse 8, and that he secretly arranged to return their money, Genesis 42 verse 25, 43:23. Verse 23. He replied, "Peace to you, do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has put treasure in your sacks for you. I received your money." Then he brought Simeon out to them. Joseph's brothers fear his steward is leading them into an ambush, for the supposed crime of stealing back money used to buy grain on their previous visit, Genesis 43 verse 18. They have just finished explaining that they don't know how the money got in their packs, but they have brought it and intend to pay it back, Genesis 43 verses 19-22. The steward responds in a surprising way. First, he assures the brothers that they are not in trouble. He tells them it was God, the God worshipped by these men and their father, who returned the money in their bags. The steward insists that he received the money. That is, he knows the men paid him, and he never thought they had stolen anything, Genesis 42 verses 26-28. This is both strange and meaningful. Of course, the steward knows he put the money back in their packs at Joseph's command, Genesis 42 verse 25. Still, he gives credit to God for returning it. This is not likely a lie, but simply the steward following Joseph's command. Most likely, the steward sees himself as the means by which their God accomplished his will. At this point, of course, the brothers have no idea that the Egyptian governor is Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8. Such mysteries aside, the steward's explanation fits the theme of Joseph's story. God accomplishes his will in unexpected and sometimes startling ways. When the brothers left from their first trip, they were forced to leave one of their number behind as collateral, Genesis 42 verses 19-20, 24. As the steward is reassuring them, he also releases their brother Simeon to them. This would have been an immense relief, and a powerful sign that no harm was coming to the men. Verse 24. And when the man had brought the men into Joseph's house and given them water, and they had washed their feet, and when he had given their donkeys fodder. Joseph's steward has fully assured Jacob's sons, now 11 with the return of Simeon, Genesis 43 verse 23, that they are guests and not prisoners of the Egyptian ruler, Genesis 43 verses 16-22. As guests, they are provided the customary hospitality of water for washing and food for their animals. Perhaps the brothers begin to relax, though are likely still confused as to why this Egyptian ruler is treating them with such honor. They don't realize the ruler is Joseph, their own brother, Genesis 42 verse 8. Though they'd sold him into slavery 20 years ago, Genesis 37 verses 24-28, Joseph's intentions for them are good. He has a few more tests in mind, as shown in the rest of this passage. In the end, he will rescue his entire family from starvation, Genesis 47 verses 11-12. Verse 25. They prepared the present for Joseph's coming at noon, for they heard that they should eat bread there. 11 of Jacob's sons, Genesis 43 verses 1-2, are now honored guests, Genesis 43 verses 23-24, in the home of the Egyptian ruler who had previously threatened them, Genesis 42:14, 19-20, to improve their chances. they prepare their own gift for him. This is an assortment of Canaanite specialties sent by their father Jacob, Genesis 43 verse 11. Those were prepared to convince the Egyptian governor not to punish the men or harm their youngest brother, Benjamin. They have learned that the ruler will arrive to eat a meal with them at noon. Before long, the men will learn that this man is their estranged brother Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, whom the oldest 10 had sold into slavery 20 years earlier, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. Though he continues to test and examine them, Joseph's ultimate intentions are good, Genesis 47 verses 11 to 12. Verse 26. When Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present that they had with them and bowed down to him to the ground. 11 of Jacob's sons, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2, are profusely bowing, Genesis 43 verse 28, before the second most powerful man in Egypt. They don't realize this is their own brother, Joseph, Genesis 42 verse 8, whom they'd sold into slavery 20 years ago, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. That hateful, jealous decision was made in part because of Joseph's dreams. One such dream symbolically depicted the brothers bowing in submission to Joseph, Genesis 37 verses 5 to 8. This moment is the complete fulfillment of that prophecy. Though they bow, the 11 men are honored guests. Joseph is now a powerful Egyptian ruler, Genesis 41 verse 44, who had previously threatened the 10 older brothers as spies, Genesis 42 verse 14. Joseph arrives to share the noon meal with them, and they present to him a gift, Genesis 43 verse 11, of fruit, gum, honey, pistachio nuts, and other local Canaanite goods. Joseph's second prophetic dream from his youth involved his entire family bowing before him, as well, along with the 11 of them, Genesis 37 verses 9 to 10. Joseph must be aware that dream is yet to be fulfilled, because he immediately asks about their father in the following verse, Genesis 43 verse 27. Verse 27. And he inquired about their welfare and said, Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive? Some 20 years earlier, a young Joseph dreamt his brothers and entire family would one day bow before him, Genesis 37 verses 5 to 10. This was one reason the jealous brothers sold him into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. Over time, Joseph was lifted to become the second most powerful man in the entire nation, Genesis 41 verse 44. When his brothers arrived to buy grain during a famine, they did not recognize him, Genesis 42 verse 8, and Joseph tested them, Genesis 42:14, 19 to 20. On their second trip, they bring their youngest brother Benjamin, and Joseph's first dream is fulfilled, Genesis 43 verse 26. After Joseph's 11 brothers bow, honoring his position, he immediately asks them about their father. Perhaps a touch eagerly, he inquires if the old father they mentioned, Genesis 42 verse 11, is still alive. It's a valid question. Joseph has been gone from home a long time, and Jacob is very old. Verse 28. They said, Your servant our father is well, he is still alive. And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. Joseph's brothers continue to respond to him with great respect and humility, Genesis 43 verse 26. At this point, they only see him as the second most powerful man in Egypt, Genesis 42 verse 8, who had previously accused them of being spies, Genesis 42 verse 14. They don't realize they are being tested by the same brother they once sold into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. Joseph has asked about the father they mentioned on their first trip, Genesis 42 verse 11. After noting that Jacob is still alive, the men bow even lower, prostrating themselves fully to the ground. Once they learn who Joseph is, they will have no doubt that his prophetic dream all those years earlier has been fulfilled, Genesis 37 verses 5 to 8. Verse 29. And he lifted up his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your youngest brother, of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son." The 11 men laying flat on the floor before him are Joseph's own brothers. They have been summoned, Genesis 43 verses 16 to 17, during their second trip to buy grain in Egypt, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2. 20 years earlier, Joseph prophesied his entire family would one day bow before him, Genesis 37 verses 5 to 10. This was part of what motivated his 10 older brothers to sell him into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. Now Joseph, unrecognized by his family, Genesis 42 verse 8, is the second in command over the entire nation of Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 44. As the men bow, they fully complete the prediction from Joseph's first dream. Joseph has asked them the men about their father, his father Jacob, Genesis 43 verses 27 to 28. Now he sets his eyes fully on Benjamin. This is the youngest son of Jacob, and Joseph's only full-blooded brother, the other son of their mother, Rachel, Genesis 35 verses 18 to 19, 24. Joseph had insisted the men not return unless they brought Benjamin with them, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. Still hiding his identity, he asks if this is the brother mentioned in their first visit, Genesis 42 verse 13. Benjamin is the only one of Joseph's 11 brothers not involved in his sale into slavery. Unlike the harsh response Joseph used when he first saw the others, Genesis 42 verse 7, he speaks kindly to Benjamin. Though Joseph has further tests in mind for his brothers, Genesis 43 verse 34, 44:1-2, the blessing he offers here strains his self-control. In the following verse, Genesis 43 verse 30, it becomes clear the dam holding back Joseph's joy is beginning to crack. Verse 30. Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. After warmly and politely speaking to his younger brother Benjamin, Genesis 43 verse 29, Joseph becomes very emotional. As the second most powerful man in the nation of Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 44, he cannot lose control in a public setting. Instead, he goes to his own room and cries alone to get his emotions under control once more. Joseph's intense reaction is driven by the unique circumstances of this reunion. He has not seen Benjamin in some 20 years. As a 17-year-old, Genesis 37 verse 2, Joseph was sold into slavery by his jealous older brothers, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. This did not include the youngest, Benjamin. Over the next 20 years, Joseph rose to become governor of Egypt and the main reason the nation survived an intense famine, Genesis 41 verse 46, 53 to 54. Joseph disguised his identity from his brothers when they came to buy grain, Genesis 42 verses 7 to 8, but arranged for them to bring Benjamin back, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. This is the first time in decades he has seen his only younger brother. Joseph's brothers still have no idea that this powerful Egyptian ruler is the person they sold into slavery as a teenager. Joseph continues to hide this fact from them, as he has further tests in mind, Genesis 43 verse 34, 44:1-2. Clearly, he is deeply affected by being reunited with them. Eventually, it will become clear that Joseph's intentions are good, Genesis 47 verses 11 to 12. For now, there is no hint about when or if Joseph will reveal himself to them. Verse 31. Then he washed his face and came out. And controlling himself he said, "Serve the food." Joseph has regained control of his emotions after seeing his younger brother, Benjamin, for the first time in 20 years, Genesis 43 verses 29 to 30. As a teenager, Joseph was sold into slavery by his jealous older brothers, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28. Over time, he rose to become the second most powerful man in Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 44. When his older brothers arrived to buy grain during a famine, they did not recognize him, Genesis 42 verse 8. To test them, and see his other brother, Joseph instructed them to only come back if they brought Benjamin, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. And so, Benjamin was brought as part of a second trip by Jacob's sons to buy grain in Egypt, Genesis 43 verses 1 to 2. Though the brothers still do not recognize him, Joseph's emotions at seeing his estranged family are evident. Only after composing himself does he order food to be served, as the brothers are now his honored guests, Genesis 43 verses 16 to 25. Further tests are in store for Joseph's brothers, Genesis 43 verse 34, 44:1-2. Verse 32. They served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. Though his brothers still do not recognize him, Genesis 42 verse 8, Joseph is treating them as honored guests. He is now the second most powerful man in Egypt, Genesis 41 verse 44. As part of his testing and reuniting with the family who sold him into slavery, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, Joseph is hosting a banquet for them, Genesis 43 verses 16 to 25. The noon meal is served to three distinct groups, who all sit separately. First, Joseph sits and eats alone. The brothers sit together. Finally, the Egyptians sharing in the meal sit in a third grouping. Apparently, Egyptian custom did not allow for sharing a table with Hebrews or perhaps any foreigners, Genesis 46 verse 34. Joseph's seating might be for that reason, the Egyptians know he is a Hebrew. However, Joseph was also well integrated into Egyptian society, Genesis 41 verses 42 and 45, 50, so this might not have been an issue for him. Another possibility is that Joseph was seated separately as a sign of his status and power. Perhaps he could not be seated with common people, even Egyptians. Regardless of the exact reasons, all these men are in the same room, but likely at entirely separate tables. Joseph will test them, in a sense, by greatly favoring Benjamin, Genesis 43 verse 34, perhaps gauging their reaction. Verse 33. And they sat before him, the firstborn according to his birthright and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Jacob's sons do not realize that the powerful Egyptian governor is their estranged brother, Joseph, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, 42:8. They only know they were commanded to bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20, and are now being honored with a meal at the governor's home, Genesis 43 verses 16 to 25. They are seated according to Egyptian custom, which means separating Egyptians from non-Egyptians, and likely priestly or government officials from common laymen, Genesis 43 verse 32. The brothers are seated according to their birth order. Since they are said to be amazed, many interpreters assume the men were not told to sit in that order, but that the house steward seated them that way, on Joseph's orders. From their perspective, then, it would be incredible that they'd be seated in exactly the right pattern. Another possibility is that they were told to sit in birth order and are simply amazed at the entire process. This seating order will also provide a test for the brothers in the form of favoritism, Genesis 43 verse 34. Clearly, the group is still unaware that the Egyptian vizier who hosts them is Joseph, their brother. Modern readers can cover the chapters from Joseph's enslavement to this incident in only a few minutes. This makes it easy to forget that it has been some 20 years since Joseph lived with them. Joseph was 17 when he was sold, Genesis 37 verse 2, 30 when he became governor, Genesis 41 verse 46, and it has been more than 7 years since, Genesis 41 verses 53 to 55. He has also been fully integrated into Egyptian culture, including his clothes, Genesis 41 verse 42, his new name and wife, Genesis 41 verse 45, and his use of Egyptian language, Genesis 42 verse 23. Joseph's brothers, on the other hand, have likely only grown older, but kept the same general appearance and language. As a set of brothers, they're also a more easily recognized group. It's not surprising that Joseph knew who they were when they first came to buy grain, Genesis 42 verse 7. Verse 34. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs. And they drank and were merry with him. 11 of Jacob's sons, the 10 oldest and the youngest, Benjamin, are seated in birth order at a banquet hosted by the governor of Egypt, Genesis 43 verses 32 to 33. The men don't realize the Egyptian leader is the missing brother, Joseph, Genesis 42 verses 7 to 8. Though they sold him as a slave 20 years earlier, Genesis 37 verses 24 to 28, he has risen to power and is now testing his estranged family, Genesis 42 verses 19 to 20. This will all work out for good, eventually, Genesis 47 verses 11 to 12. For now, Joseph seems interested in examining whether his older brothers can forgive favoritism. Joseph's test involves giving Benjamin an outrageously large portion of food at the banquet. The proportion of 5 times might have been significant in Egyptian culture. This echoes the extreme favoritism shown by Jacob to Joseph many years prior, Genesis 37 verses 3 to 4. It's possible Joseph wants to see if the older brothers show any signs of jealousy. Regardless of any confusion or surprise, the men seem to become fully relaxed, eating and drinking and becoming merry with Joseph. The alcohol may have had something to do with their merriment, along with the stress relief of seeing Simeon released and their father's beloved Benjamin treated so well. Scholars debate if the Hebrew term shakar used here is a reference to drunkenness or simple happiness. The King James, for instance, translates this term as a reference to intoxication 16 out of the 19 times it is used in the Old Testament. That doesn't absolutely mean the brothers were drunk, but it does prove their spirits were high and they didn't seem bothered by Benjamin's oversized portions. Of course, more surprises are yet to be revealed in this encounter, Genesis 44 verses 1 to 2. End of chapter 43. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.